The courthouse in Dover, Delaware, buzzed with quiet anticipation, the kind that filled the air just before something important was about to unfold. It was a typical Monday morning, the time dragging slowly as people waited for the next case. The courtroom benches were filled with spectators whose faces were a mixture of boredom and curiosity. Today's docket looked routine: a minor public disturbance, some property disputes, and a case involving an off-duty officer. Nothing that would make the headlines, yet there was an unspoken tension that seemed to ripple through the room. Behind the polished wood of the bench sat Judge Evelyn Carter. She wasn't one for show and didn't need to be. With over 25 years of experience, her reputation was built on fairness and a sharp intellect that could cut through the thickest of arguments. She had a way of making everyone around her take notice without raising her voice. People respected her not because she demanded it, but because her presence commanded it. The air in the room always seemed to shift when she spoke, each word carefully considered. Today, though, there was an unfamiliar vibe. The routine proceedings hadn't yet stirred anything remarkable, but there was an undeniable feeling that something would happen. Then the door to the courtroom creaked open, and in walked Officer Liam Matthews, fresh out of the academy. His uniform was spotless, and he walked with the kind of swagger that made it impossible to ignore. He wasn't just a rookie, he carried an air of arrogance, as though he believed he had already mastered the law. His eyes scanned the room briefly locking with Judge Carter's before quickly shifting away. She acknowledged him with a simple nod, her face unreadable. It wasn't the first time a young officer had walked into her courtroom with a sense of superiority, but there was something about Matthews that made her pause. His confidence, or perhaps overconfidence, stood out in the sea of faces. As the morning's cases proceeded, Matthews sat back in his chair, seemingly indifferent to the proceedings around him. He was impatient, his eyes occasionally flicking over to Judge Carter. His posture, though relaxed, radiated a challenge, a silent assumption that he was above it all. Finally, his name was called. Matthews stood, his body stiff with military-like precision, and strode forward to the defendant's table, his feet echoing through the otherwise quiet room. His attorney, a man in his mid-40s with a tired expression, leaned in to whisper something in his ear. Matthews barely acknowledged him, his eyes fixed on the judge, as if daring her to question his actions. Judge Carter watched him carefully. She had dealt with cocky officers before, young, eager, and full of themselves. But Matthews' arrogance struck a different chord. He wasn't simply confident, he seemed to believe that he could control the courtroom, not just follow its rules. "Officer Matthews," Judge Carter began, her voice even and controlled, "you're here to answer allegations of excessive force during an arrest. Do you understand the seriousness of these charges?" Matthews' gaze didn't falter. "Of course, Your Honor," he said, his tone more flippant than respectful. "But I've reviewed the footage myself, and I believe this situation has been blown out of proportion." A slight smirk tugged at the corners of his lips, but Judge Carter didn't flinch. She had seen this type of defiance before, and she wasn't about to let it derail the proceedings. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense attitude, stepped forward. "We have evidence, Your Honor," he began, signaling for the body camera footage to be played. Matthews, still seated with his arms crossed, didn't look worried. He was confident the footage would support him, even though it was clear to the gallery that his bravado was beginning to show cracks. The footage began to play. Matthews was shown interacting with a suspect, a young man accused of petty theft. The video quickly revealed a disturbing escalation, with Matthews using force almost immediately after the suspect had failed to fully comply with his orders. It was an aggressive approach, one that seemed far too severe for the situation. As the video concluded, Judge Carter leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Matthews. "Officer Matthews," she said, her voice calm but stern, "how do you explain what we just witnessed?" Matthews shifted in his seat, straightening his posture, but the smirk remained. He was still convinced he could talk his way out of this. "Your Honor, as I said before, it's a misunderstanding. The suspect resisted, and I had to act. People outside of law enforcement don't understand that sometimes situations escalate quickly. I was doing my job, ensuring public safety." Judge Carter's eyes never wavered. Her expression was as calm as ever, though the weight of her words carried an undeniable force. Officer Matthews, this is a courtroom, not a field exercise. You are here to answer for your actions, not to justify them based on what you think others may or may not understand. Your actions will be judged on their merit, not your interpretation of the situation. The gallery, which had been relatively quiet until now, shifted slightly. Matthew's tone was starting to test the patience of the room. He wasn't just defending himself, he was challenging the authority of the court itself. The sense of discomfort in the air grew stronger, and Matthews, clearly unaware of how far his tone was pushing the limits, leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on an edge. "I understand your concern, Your Honor," Matthews replied, the faintest hint of sarcasm creeping into his words. "But sometimes, in the heat of the moment, decisions need to be made quickly. It's easy to sit here and judge from a distance, but in the field, the stakes are much higher. I'm sure you know that." Judge Carter's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but she didn't let the words rattle her. Instead, she gave a soft but deliberate tap of her gavel, signaling for the room to settle. Her voice when she spoke was colder than before, and the room seemed to hush in response. "Officer Matthews," she said, her words sharp but controlled, "this court is not here to debate tactics or to engage in hypotheticals. We are here to examine facts, evidence, and the law. Your conduct today will weigh heavily on your credibility in this case. I suggest you adjust your attitude accordingly." Matthews opened his mouth to respond, but something in Judge Carter's unwavering stare caused him to pause. The smirk faded, replaced by a more calculated expression. For a brief moment, he considered challenging her again, but then, with an exaggerated shrug, he leaned back in his chair, his arms folded across his chest. "Understood, Your Honor," he said, though the sarcasm in his tone was still clear. The prosecutor, sensing an opening, stepped forward. He began to outline the next phase of the case, presenting witness statements and the body camera footage that painted a clearer picture of Matthews' actions. The footage showed Matthews' escalating use of force against the suspect, even after the young man had started to comply. The gallery shifted uneasily as the footage continued, each moment highlighting how the officer's approach had become more aggressive than necessary. When the video ended, Judge Carter turned her attention back to Matthews. The calm in her expression remained, but the intensity of her gaze was undeniable. "Officer Matthews," she began, her voice unwavering, "you've seen the footage. How do you explain the escalation in your actions when the suspect was, for the most part, complying?" Matthews straightened his back, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "Your Honor, the situation was fluid. Yes, the suspect was starting to comply, but then he made a sudden move that could have been an attempt to resist. I didn't take chances. I acted quickly because the safety of those around me was my first priority." Judge Carter raised an eyebrow, her expression one of skepticism. "The footage shows the suspect complying fully before any escalation took place. So tell me, Officer Matthews, why escalate when compliance was already underway?" There was a brief silence as Matthews fumbled for a response, clearly unprepared for such a pointed question. His confidence began to crack, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. I was just trying to maintain control of the situation, Your Honor," Matthews stammered, his earlier bravado faltering. "It's not always clear-cut in the field." Judge Carter nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving him. "No, Officer Matthews, it isn't. But the law is clear. Your role as an officer is not to escalate a situation based on assumptions. It's to de-escalate when possible, and to use force only when absolutely necessary." Her voice softened, but her words held weight. "Your badge does not give you the right to blur those lines." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Matthews sat frozen, his expression a mix of frustration and uncertainty. For the first time, it seemed as if the full weight of his actions was beginning to settle on him. Judge Carter allowed a long pause before continuing. "This is not about second-guessing your instincts, Officer Matthews. This is about understanding that your responsibility goes beyond the heat of the moment. Your decisions must align with the law, not your personal interpretation of what might have happened." The gallery remained still, waiting for Matthews to respond, but he had no words. His hands, once clasped confidently in front of him, now fidgeted nervously as he tried to regain some control over the situation. The prosecutor, sensing the shift in Matthew's confidence, continued with the presentation of evidence. A series of witness statements were read aloud, each one painting a picture that contradicted Matthew's defense. A bystander, a woman in her 40s, had witnessed the incident and recorded the interaction on her phone. Her statement was clear. She described the suspect as cooperative and compliant before Matthew's forceful actions. As the statement was read, Matthew's face flushed a deep red, and he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His attorney, seeing the cracks in Matthew's defense, leaned in to offer some words of advice. Matthews, however, barely acknowledged him, his eyes focused on the table in front of him, his hands now clenched into fists. The evidence was mounting against him, and it was beginning to sink in that he might not be able to talk his way out of this. Judge Carter, observing Matthew's growing discomfort, did not miss the subtle signs. She looked down at the statement, then back at the officer. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, as she addressed him once more. "Officer Matthews," she said, her tone unwavering, "this testimony, combined with the footage, paints a troubling picture. You claim that your actions were justified, yet the accounts of those who witnessed the incident tell a different story. The suspect was cooperative until you escalated the situation. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Matthews hesitated for a moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice lacked the confident tone it had carried earlier. "Your Honor, I don't think the witness fully understood what was going on. People outside of the situation often see things differently. The suspect could have been faking compliance. I had to act quickly." Judge Carter's eyes narrowed slightly as she absorbed his response. "So, your defense is that the witness misunderstood what they saw?" she asked, her voice growing colder. "Do you believe that every person who disagrees with your assessment is simply wrong, Officer Matthews? Or is it possible that you may have misjudged the situation?" The question hung in the air, and Matthews shifted uncomfortably, his usual bravado now replaced with frustration. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Judge Carter, sensing the opportunity, pressed on. "Your Honor," the prosecutor interjected, his voice firm but measured. "We also have additional footage, this time from a phone recording taken by a bystander standing a few feet away. It provides a different perspective on the incident and corroborates the witness testimony. It shows the suspect's compliance before the escalation. It shows the use of force that was unnecessary." The prosecutor nodded, signaling for the footage to be played. As the video began, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. The camera angle was slightly different from the body camera footage, but it was clear. The suspect stood with his hands raised, pleading with Matthews to stop. His voice was shaky but sincere as he begged the officer to ease up. Matthews' grip on the young man tightened, and in an instant, the suspect was slammed against the side of the patrol car. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the video continued to unfold. The footage captured the raw, unsettling truth of the situation. Matthews had escalated a situation that could have been resolved with patience and restraint. The suspect was on the ground, defenseless, and Matthews stood over him, his hands still gripping the man's arms as though there was a real threat present. When the video ended, Judge Carter's expression was hard to read, but her tone was as sharp as ever. "Officer Matthews," she said, her voice quiet but intense, "you've now seen both the body camera footage and the bystander video. These are not isolated incidents. This is a clear pattern of behavior. How do you explain your actions in light of this evidence?" Matthews sat rigidly in his chair, his hands now trembling slightly. The arrogance he had walked in with had all but disappeared, replaced by an overwhelming sense of unease. His mouth opened and closed, but no coherent words came out. He couldn't deny the footage, and the weight of the evidence was becoming too much to ignore. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Your Honor, as I said earlier, the situation was fluid. The suspect resisted arrest in a way that made me feel unsafe. People don't understand the pressure we face out there. I did what I thought was necessary in the moment." Judge Carter folded her hands in front of her, her gaze never leaving Matthews. "You keep using the word resistance, but the footage shows a completely different story. The suspect was not resisting. He was simply complying with your commands. Your reaction was not only disproportionate, it was reckless. You chose to escalate instead of de-escalating. The law doesn't give you the right to make such decisions based on a hunch. Matthew's frustration was palpable now. His eyes darted between his attorney, the prosecutor, and Judge Carter. His usual smugness had vanished, replaced by a young man who was slowly realizing the depth of his mistake. The silence in the room grew heavier as everyone awaited his next words. The gavel tapped lightly, signaling another brief pause in the proceedings. The pressure was mounting on Matthews. He had no easy way out of this now. The courtroom had gone deathly silent as the footage ended, and all eyes were on Officer Matthews. His confidence had all but evaporated. He was no longer the cocky rookie who had entered the courtroom with arrogance in his step. Instead, he looked like a man on the edge, struggling to hold on to whatever shred of dignity remained. Judge Carter's gaze remained unwavering. She folded her hands on the bench and leaned slightly forward, her voice cool but direct. Officer Matthews, we've seen the evidence. The body camera footage, the bystander video, the witness statements, they all point to the same conclusion. Your actions were not justified, and they were far from necessary. You've had ample opportunity to explain yourself, but your defense is growing weaker by the minute. Matthew's eyes darted around the room, his frustration clear. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form a response, the prosecutor intervened. Your Honor, I believe the evidence speaks for itself. This officer's behavior is a clear violation of the trust placed in him. He has shown no remorse for his actions, and the fact that he continues to justify his use of excessive force further damages his credibility. Judge Carter nodded slowly, acknowledging the prosecutor's words before returning her attention to Matthews. I have heard your excuses, Officer Matthews, and I've seen the evidence. But now I want to hear the truth. You've had every chance to explain your actions in a way that reflects the responsibility of your position. Now it's time for you to decide whether you're going to continue with this defense or face the reality of your mistakes. The room seemed to hold its breath as Matthews stared at the judge. For a brief moment, he seemed to be wrestling with something inside himself. The arrogant facade he'd built up throughout the morning was crumbling, and in its place there was a glimpse of vulnerability. He wasn't just defending his actions anymore. He was trying to save himself from the consequences of those actions. I thought I was doing the right thing, Matthews said, his voice strained. I acted the way I thought I was supposed to. The situation was getting out of hand, and I didn't want anyone to get hurt. But maybe I overreacted. He paused, his gaze falling to the floor, as if he couldn't meet the eyes of the courtroom. Maybe I shouldn't have handled it that way. The moment hung in the air, and for the first time, there was a shift in Matthews. The arrogance had faded, replaced by something else. Humility, perhaps, or at least the acknowledgement that he had gone too far. His hands, once tightly clenched, were now resting nervously on the table. Judge Carter observed him closely. The judge had seen many officers in her courtroom, each one different in their demeanor, but Matthews' transformation was striking. His realization, though late, was a crucial one. Officer Matthews, she said, her voice measured but firm, it's a step in the right direction to admit when you've made a mistake, but that doesn't erase the harm that was caused. The trust between the police and the community you serve is fragile. Your actions have chipped away at that trust. Matthews swallowed hard, his throat tight with regret. I understand, Your Honor. I wasn't thinking. I should have handled it differently. Judge Carter nodded, her expression softening slightly, though not entirely. Acknowledging the problem is the first step, but your actions have consequences. The public depends on law enforcement officers to serve and protect, not to escalate situations unnecessarily, especially when people's lives are at stake. She turned to the prosecutor and the defense attorney before returning her gaze to Matthews. Officer Matthews, this court has listened to all the evidence and statements. It is clear to me that your actions on that day were not justifiable. You misused your authority, and as a result, you will face the consequences of your choices. Matthews' face tightened, and for a split second, he looked like he was preparing for a more severe judgment. But Judge Carter's voice remained steady as she continued. I'm placing you on probation for a period of 1 year. Additionally, you will undergo mandatory retraining on de-escalation techniques and the proper use of force. I will also require that you issue a formal apology to the individual involved in this incident. This is not merely a punishment, Officer Matthews. It is an opportunity for you to reflect on your actions and learn from your mistakes. Matthews sat there in stunned silence. The gravity of the situation was beginning to sink in. His earlier bravado, his belief that he could outsmart the system, had been shattered. The gavel came down with a sharp tap, signaling the end of the hearing. "Do not waste this opportunity," Judge Carter said, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. "Your badge represents trust. If you fail to regain that trust, the consequences will be much greater than any reprimand this court can give." As the courtroom began to stir, Matthews remained seated, his head lowered. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but Matthews didn't respond. He was too lost in thought, grappling with the realization that his arrogance had led him to this point. He had failed, and now he had to face the consequences, not just in this courtroom, but in the eyes of the public and the community he had sworn to serve. The courtroom slowly began to empty, the murmurs of the spectators echoing through the quiet halls. Judge Carter remained seated, her eyes still on Officer Matthews as he stood and walked out of the courtroom. The sound of his footsteps was faint, but carried a weight that seemed to resonate through the room. For the first time, Matthews appeared different, no longer the confident rookie with a chip on his shoulder, but a young man humbled by the consequences of his own actions. As the last of the spectators filed out, Judge Carter leaned back in her chair, her mind already drifting to the lesson of the day. She had seen many officers come and go in her courtroom, some with arrogance, others with humility. But Matthews' case felt different. It was more than just a disciplinary hearing. It was about something deeper. It was about understanding the true nature of authority, about recognizing that power is not a privilege to be wielded, but a responsibility to be honored. The prosecutor and defense attorney exchanged brief words before leaving, the case now closed. But Judge Carter knew the real work was just beginning for Matthews. The lesson she hoped he would take away from this wasn't just about following protocols. It was about respecting the trust that the public placed in law enforcement. Outside the courtroom, Matthews' attorney gave him a few words of encouragement, but Matthews seemed distant, his mind lost in thought. He had come into this courtroom thinking he could handle everything, that his experience as an officer would be enough to dismiss any doubts about his actions. But now, with the judgment delivered, the weight of his responsibility was sinking in. Judge Carter had been firm, but her verdict was also fair. She had given him a chance to redeem himself, to reflect on what it meant to serve and protect. Not through force and intimidation, but with wisdom, restraint, and empathy. Whether Matthews would take that lesson to heart was uncertain, but Judge Carter hoped that this experience would change him for the better. As the courtroom doors closed behind him, Matthews stopped for a moment, standing at the threshold. He looked back toward the judge's bench, where Judge Carter sat, watching him leave. Their eyes met for a brief second, and in that moment, Matthews saw something he hadn't noticed before. Something deeper than the courtroom itself. It was the weight of justice, the quiet strength of fairness, and the responsibility of his badge. For a fleeting moment, Matthews understood that his journey as a law enforcement officer was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Judge Carter's voice echoed in his mind as he exited the building. "Your badge represents trust. If you fail to regain that trust, the consequences will be much greater than any reprimand this court can give." Those words would stay with him. He had a lot to learn. Back in the courtroom, Judge Carter stood, gathering her papers. She looked at the empty benches and the cold, quiet room. Justice wasn't just about the decisions made in a courtroom. It was about the actions people took every day. It was about the courage to admit when we were wrong, to reflect on our choices, and to have the strength to do better the next time. For Matthews, it was clear. This was his opportunity to grow, to rise above the mistakes of his past, and to learn what it truly meant to serve. And for Judge Carter, it was a reminder that sometimes the most difficult lessons were the ones that stayed with us the longest. As the last few people filed out of the courthouse, the story of that day, the arrogance of Officer Matthews, the wisdom of Judge Carter, and the undeniable power of accountability lingered in the air, a lesson not just for those who were present, but for anyone willing to listen. The courtroom may have emptied, but the weight of the lesson was still there, hanging in the air, waiting for someone to take it to heart. And, just maybe, Matthews would be the one to do so.